Have you ever wondered why English gardens look the way they do today? They weren't always the rambling romantic havens we know and love. In fact, their origins are surprisingly stiff and structured. Join us as we dig into the dramatic evolution of these iconic spaces, unearthing the fascinating shifts in design and thought that transformed them from formal to utterly wild. The Romans occupied Britain for 400 years, bringing straight roads, town planning, a new religion, and a new language. In the garden, they changed Britain's diet, introducing new fruits, vegetables, herbs, and nuts. They also planted neatly clipped box hedges laid out around rectangular courtyards and built covered walkways or pergolas, elements included in many garden designs today. Ideas on garden design also travelled from the Far East to Europe, following trade routes and conquests. Elements of European garden design can be traced back to Persia. From the early 8th century, the Muslim conquests saw Islamic charbar garden design introduced to the southern Mediterranean. These geometric four-part gardens, representing the four gardens of paradise in the Quran, incorporated rills, running water, and scented plants, and had a strong influence on the Moorish gardens of Spain. In Britain, wealth centred around the monasteries and the monarch. Monastic gardens were a hive of activity. Monks and nuns buzzed through kitchen gardens, growing food, managing fish ponds, and tending to their crops and animals. They also grew medicinal herbs and plants to support health and healing. When the Normans arrived in 1066, they quickly built around 500 fortified castles across Britain. Intimate courtyard gardens were often created for the lady of the house inside the castle grounds, reminiscent of the flower-filled bowers of Renaissance art. The end of the Wars of the Roses brought peace to England and a new ruling dynasty, the Tudors. Palaces and country manors became places for the court to meet, designed for politics and pleasure. Gardens incorporated arbours, sundials, knot gardens, fish ponds, tilt yards for jousting, and the occasional tennis court, all surrounded by hunting grounds rich with fowl and deer. The rigid geometry of early English gardens, particularly those designed during the 16th and 17th centuries, was heavily influenced by the formal garden traditions of France and Italy. These continental styles emphasized symmetry, proportion, and visual control, all rooted in Renaissance ideals of harmony and human dominion over the natural world. In adopting these principles, early English gardens became reflections not only of continental taste, but of broader cultural aspirations toward order, refinement, and authority. Italian Renaissance gardens, such as those at Villa d'Este or Villa Lante, emphasized axial layouts, terracing, and the integration of classical architecture and sculpture. They were designed to be experienced as a sequence of orchestrated views and spatial experiences, with water features and plantings reinforcing the sense of engineered perfection. The French formal garden, exemplified by André Le Nautre's designs at Versailles, took these principles further, using vast parterres, long sightlines, and monumental scale to express absolutist ideals and royal power. In England, these influences manifested in gardens that featured straight paths, tightly clipped hedges, and geometric beds such as knot gardens and parterres. Garden compartments were often laid out in strict symmetry, enclosed by evergreen borders, and designed to be viewed from elevated positions such as terraces or upper windows, highlighting the rational order imposed on nature. Ornamentation was controlled and stylized, with a focus on balance and repetition. This rigid geometry reflected more than aesthetic preference. It symbolized control over the natural world and, by extension, over social and political life. The garden became an extension of the house, an outdoor room governed by the same principles of proportion and decorum. In this way, early English formal gardens functioned as visual declarations of status, education, and alignment with the broader European cultural elite. However, this era of geometric formality in England would eventually give way to a looser, more naturalistic landscapes in the 18th century, as tastes shifted and new philosophies, particularly those emphasising the sublime and picturesque, gained ground. But for a time, the rigid geometry of early English gardens stood as a powerful symbol of man's authority over nature, inspired by the classical rationalism of Italy and the grandiosity of French absolutism. Knot gardens, parterres and topiary are striking examples of how gardens have historically reflected societal ideals, particularly those of control, order and dominion over nature. Emerging prominently during the Renaissance and Baroque periods, these highly stylized garden forms exemplify a worldview in which nature was seen not as an untamed force to be coexisted with, but as a resource to be shaped, organized and mastered by human intellect and power. Knot gardens with their intricate, interlaced designs made of low-growing herbs and clipped boxwood symbolised an ideal of harmony achieved through precision. Their geometric symmetry and balance were visual metaphors for rational order and human ingenuity. The garden became a stage upon which the gardener, often under the direction of aristocrats or monarchs, imposed civilization's logic upon the wild. Parterres, particularly the elaborate parterres of French formal gardens like Versailles, extended this idea to a grand theatrical scale. These sweeping ornamental ground patterns could only be fully appreciated from elevated terraces, emphasizing the godlike perspective of those in power, most notably royalty like Louis XIV, who surveyed their dominion from above. The parterre served as both a literal and symbolic demonstration of the monarch's ability to control not only land but the very forces of growth and seasonality. Topiary, the practice of sculpting trees and shrubs into architectural or fantastical shapes, pushed this concept even further. Here, nature was not merely tamed or patterned, but transformed into forms that bore no resemblance to its wild origins. Topiary asserts a human-centered aesthetic, often playful or grandiose, in which nature is reshaped to mirror cultural ideals, from classical motifs to personal emblems. It reinforced the notion that nature was a malleable medium to express status, intellect, and artistic will. Together, these garden forms embody an anthropocentric philosophy. Nature exists to be improved upon, measured, and contained. They are living artifacts of eras in which land ownership, aesthetic control, and political power were deeply intertwined, revealing a profound connection between landscape design and the social hierarchies and ideologies of the time. The philosophical shift toward the natural in garden design during the 18th century marked a radical departure from the rigid geometry and formalism of earlier Renaissance and Baroque styles. This transformation was deeply influenced by changing cultural attitudes towards nature, art, and the human relationship to the environment, most notably to the rising popularity of landscape painting and Enlightenment and Romantic philosophies. At the heart of this shift was a growing discomfort with the idea of nature as something to be dominated and controlled. Enlightenment thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau emphasized the moral and aesthetic value of nature in its unspoiled state, challenging the artificiality of formal gardens and the aristocratic ideals they symbolized. Nature was increasingly seen not as something to be subdued, but as something to be respected, even revered, for its inherent beauty and irregularity. This evolving perspective was powerfully echoed in the landscape paintings of the time, particularly those of the 17th century artists like Claude Lorraine, Nicolas Poussin, and later the English painter Thomas Gainsborough. These paintings portrayed idealized pastoral scenes, gently rolling hills, winding rivers, grazing animals, and distant classical ruins, all composed to evoke harmony, tranquility, and a sense of the sublime. Such works were not literal representations of the countryside, but carefully composed visions of a perfected yet seemingly untouched nature. Garden designers such as William Kent and Lancelot Capability Brown translated these artistic ideals into the physical landscape. Inspired by the compositional techniques of painters, they began designing gardens that mimicked natural scenery, introducing serpentine paths, irregular lakes, groves of trees, and strategically placed follies to create a sense of organic flow and visual surprise. The aim was to make the garden look like a living landscape painting, with each vista framed as if it were a canvas brought to life. The new English landscape garden style became a philosophical and aesthetic statement. It celebrated the natural over the artificial, the emotional over the rational, and the picturesque over the symmetrical. It reflected a deeper desire for authenticity and a closer communion with the natural world, aligning with romantic ideals that valued emotion, individual experience, and the sublime power of nature. In short, the influence of landscape painting helped reshape the very idea of what a garden could be. Rather than a rigid display of human control, the garden became a space for reflection, imagination, and emotional engagement, a place where nature and culture could meet on more equal, even poetic, terms. Lancelot Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton were two of the most influential figures in the development of the English landscape garden, a style that broke dramatically with the geometric formality of earlier garden traditions. Their work redefined the aesthetics of landscape design in the 18th and early 19th centuries, emphasizing naturalistic beauty, harmony, and the illusion of untouched countryside, though, in truth, it was anything but untouched. Capability Brown earned his nickname from his habit of referring to properties as having great capabilities for improvement. Brown's gardens featured sweeping lawns that flowed seamlessly to the horizon, gently undulating terrain, clumps of trees arranged for compositional effect, and curving serpentine lakes that appeared to follow the natural contours of the land. He famously removed formal elements such as parterres, walled gardens, and rigid avenues in favour of open, flowing spaces that evoked the pastoral ideal. Brown's genius lay in creating carefully composed naturalistic scenes that mimicked the beauty found in landscape painting, especially those of Claude Lorraine. His work at estates like Stowe, Blenheim Palace and Chatsworth helped establish a new aesthetic language in which the landscape itself became an artistic expression, seemingly wild but in fact meticulously engineered. Even his lakes were often created by damming rivers and reshaping valleys to enhance the illusion of nature's perfection. In championing the illusion of wilderness, the landscape garden also reflected changing attitudes toward nature itself. It became less a force to be conquered and more a source for aesthetic and emotional experience. The garden was now a place for reflection, meditation, and a romantic engagement with the sublime. This reimagined relationship with nature aligned with broader cultural movements in art, literature, and philosophy, especially Romanticism. In essence, the landscape garden masked artifice with apparent naturalism. Where the formal garden declared its artificiality proudly, the new aesthetic whispered it. This contrast reveals not only a transformation in taste, but a deeper evolution in how people understood beauty, power, and their place within the natural world. The Victorian era witnessed a dramatic resurgence of vibrant floral displays in garden design, fueled by a potent mix of technological innovation, imperial expansion, and botanical curiosity. This period marked a shift away from the restrained naturalism of the earlier English landscape garden toward a more exuberant ornamental style. At the heart of this transformation was the global phenomenon of plant hunting, the adventurous and often perilous pursuit of exotic species from around the world, which reshaped both the aesthetics and ambitions of 19th century gardening. Driven by British colonial expansion and the rise of scientific exploration, plant hunters travelled to Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Australasia in search of new and unusual specimens. These expeditions introduced a dazzling array of plants to British gardens, including rhododendrons, camellias, tree ferns, primulas, lilies, and orchids, many of which had never before been seen in Europe. Collectors such as Joseph Hooker, Robert Fortune, and George Forrest returned with botanical treasures that were eagerly cultivated in both public and private gardens. The growing availability of these exotic plants coincided with technological advancements that supported their display and preservation. The invention of the Wardian case, a sealed glass container for transporting live plants, allowed delicate species to survive long sea voyages. Simultaneously, the development of the heated glass house or conservatory enabled gardeners to cultivate tropical and subtropical plants in the often harsh British climate. These structures became icons of Victorian garden culture, ranging from ornate public greenhouses like the Palm House at Kew Gardens to smaller versions in domestic estates. Victorian garden design became characterised by richly planted, colourful bedding schemes, often involving annuals such as geraniums, petunias, lobelias and salvias. These were laid out in geometric or carpet-like patterns, emphasising contrast, texture and precise coordination, an echo of earlier formal gardens but now saturated with botanical variety. The use of carpet bedding became a display of both horticultural prowess and imperial pride, as landowners and public institutions showcased their ability to command the plant riches of the empire. This era also saw the rise of the middle-class gardener, thanks to industrialisation and the expansion of suburban housing. Nurseries and seed catalogues flourished, democratising access to plants and information and making ornamental gardening a popular pastime across social classes. Garden magazines, horticultural societies and flower shows further fueled public enthusiasm and competition. In sum, the Victorian revival of vibrant floral displays reflected not just a new aesthetic sensibility, but the confluence of empire, science, industry and social change. Where earlier landscape gardens had emphasised naturalistic harmony, Victorian gardens revelled in visual spectacle and botanical abundance. They celebrated the collector's impulse, the thrill of novelty, and the power of human ingenuity to gather, tame, and exhibit the world's flora, turning gardens into living museums of empire and ambition. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a marked turn away from the bold, symmetrical bedding schemes of the Victorian era toward a more romantic, naturalistic approach to garden design. This shift embraced the charm of cottage gardens with their informal layouts, profuse plantings and seasonal rhythms, while also maintaining a sense of structure and intentionality. At the forefront of this movement was Gertrude Jekyll, a visionary garden designer, writer and artist who played a pivotal role in redefining modern horticultural aesthetics. The cottage garden ideal drew inspiration from rural English traditions, where practical and ornamental plants were intermingled around humble homes. These gardens were dense, colourful and deeply personal, celebrating the intrinsic beauty of each plant rather than imposing rigid, large-scale patterns. This approach appealed to a growing middle class, disenchanted with the artificiality of carpet bedding and the imperial overtones of exotic displays. It coincided with the arts and crafts movement, which valued craftsmanship, simplicity, and a harmonious relationship between home, garden, and landscape. Gertrude Jekyll trained as a painter before turning to garden design, and she brought an artist's eye to planting. Influenced by Impressionism and the colour theories of contemporaries like Ruskin and Turner, she revolutionised the way gardeners thought about composition. She emphasised the painterly use of colour, texture and form in planting schemes, carefully orchestrating plant groupings so they would bloom in harmonious succession. She advocated for gardens that were both beautiful and botanically rich, where each plant was chosen not only for its aesthetic contribution, but also for its ecological and seasonal role. Working frequently with architect Edwin Ludens, Jekyll helped blend formality with informality. Her gardens often featured structured elements such as stone paths, low walls, terraces and pergolas that gave architectural order to otherwise loose, flowing plantings. This balance between structure and softness created a deeply satisfying, immersive experience that felt natural without being chaotic. Jekyll's influence extended through her prolific writing, including over 1,000 articles and influential books like Colour in the Flower Garden from 1908. Her philosophy inspired generations of gardeners to view the garden not merely as a place for display, but as a personal, expressive art form rooted in knowledge, sensitivity to place, and a love for plants themselves. In sum, the rise of romantic cottage garden styles and the contributions of figures like Gertrude Jekyll marked a significant evolution in garden design. This period blended the clarity and elegance of formality with a new appreciation for individual plant beauty, seasonality, and artistic expression. It reflected broader cultural movements towards simplicity, natural beauty, and emotional resonance, setting the stage for many of the ecological and personal approaches to gardening we value today. The contemporary trend of rewilding in garden design represents a significant departure from ornamental, high-maintenance gardening traditions, reflecting a growing ecological awareness and desire to restore balance between human spaces and natural systems. Rewilding, in its broadest sense, seeks to reintegrate nature into cultivated landscapes, prioritising biodiversity, sustainability, and the use of native plants to support local ecosystems. Unlike traditional garden styles that emphasise control, tidiness, and visual perfection, rewilding embraces a looser, more spontaneous aesthetic, one that often mimics natural habitats rather than imposing formal design. This can include allowing meadows to replace manicured lawns, using fallen logs and dead wood as habitat features, creating ponds for amphibians and insects, or letting weeds, often native wildflowers, flourish. The goal is not neglect, but intentional ecological restoration, designing gardens that serve both human enjoyment and environmental function. A central component of rewilding is the integration of native plants, which have co-evolved with local wildlife and are vital for supporting pollinators, birds, and insects. Unlike many exotic ornamental species, native plants provide the right food, shelter, and breeding conditions for local fauna. Their deep root systems also help improve soil health, reduce erosion, and manage stormwater, making them valuable in climate resilience efforts. This movement is both a response to and a solution for critical environmental challenges, including habitat loss, pollinator decline, and the impacts of climate change. Organisations, designers, and ecologists increasingly advocate for gardening as a form of environmental stewardship, what some call gardening with purpose. Initiatives like the Homegrown National Park in the United States, led by entomologist Douglas Tallamy, encourage homeowners to see their gardens as part of a larger ecological network. Aesthetically, rewilded gardens often adopt the principles of the new perennial movement and naturalistic planting, pioneered by designers like Peter Udolph. These gardens celebrate the dynamic life cycles of plants, valuing seed heads, decaying foliage, and seasonal change as part of their beauty. They blur the line between wild and cultivated, challenging traditional ideas of what a garden should look like. Rewilding also has a social and ethical dimension, promoting accessibility, low-maintenance approaches, and reconnection with local environments. It empowers gardeners, regardless of scale, to take meaningful action in addressing global ecological issues, fostering a deeper, more reciprocal relationship with nature. In essence, rewilding is not about returning to a past state of nature, but about creating future-facing landscapes that are rich, resilient, and life-sustaining. It's a contemporary reimagining of garden design, one that aligns ecological integrity with evolving human values around beauty, responsibility, and coexistence. Today's English gardens are increasingly defined by a focus on sustainability, biodiversity, and low-maintenance design, reflecting a broader cultural and ecological shift toward working with nature rather than trying to control it. This contemporary approach challenges centuries of human-centric gardening traditions and embraces a more collaborative, responsive relationship with natural systems. It's not just about aesthetics anymore, it's about ecological function, climate resilience, and ethical responsibility. At the heart of this movement is a commitment to biodiversity. Gardeners and designers are now prioritising native and wildlife-friendly planting, creating habitats for pollinators, birds, amphibians, and beneficial insects. This includes planting hedgerows instead of fences, wildflower meadows instead of manicured lawns, and incorporating log piles, ponds, and unmown areas to support a wide range of species throughout the year. The idea is to create gardens that are not just beautiful, but alive. Sustainability is another guiding principle. Rainwater harvesting, composting, peat-free gardening, and the reduction of chemical inputs are now common practices. Materials are often sourced locally and reused where possible. More gardeners are reducing their reliance on fossil fuels by using hand tools or electric alternatives, and planting schemes are designed to be resilient in the face of increasingly unpredictable weather patterns, drought, floods, and heat waves. Several innovative designers are leading the way in embracing these principles. Peter Udolf, though Dutch, has had a profound impact on English garden design. His projects, such as the planting at Hauser and Worth in Somerset, emphasise perennial-based, naturalistic planting that focuses on seasonal structure, texture, and ecological value. His designs celebrate the full life cycle of plants, including decay, as part of their aesthetic and ecological richness. Dan Pearson is another key figure whose work exemplifies sensitivity to place and natural processes. His garden at Tokachi Millennium Forest in Japan and his projects across the UK use native and wild species, minimal intervention, and ecological restoration to create gardens that blend seamlessly into the surrounding landscape. Nigel Dunnett, a professor of planting design at the University of Sheffield, is known for his work on urban greening and sustainable landscapes. His rain gardens and biodiverse meadows, including the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in London, use low-input planting schemes to create vibrant, resilient public spaces that support urban ecology. Sarah Price, the co-designer of the 2012 Olympic Park Gardens, is recognised for her painterly planting style rooted in natural ecology. Her gardens draw inspiration from wild landscapes and often incorporate drought-tolerant, low-maintenance species arranged in compositions that are as ecologically informed as they are beautiful. These designers and many others are reshaping the English garden tradition by integrating natural processes, environmental consciousness, and a sense of humility. Gardens are no longer just personal sanctuaries or status symbols. They are microcosms of the wider world, places where ecological care meets creative expression. This less human-centric approach doesn't eliminate human influence, but reframes it as part of a larger, interconnected system, one that acknowledges the garden not as a finished product, but as a living, evolving collaboration with nature. The history of English garden design reveals a rich and cyclical evolution, swinging between ideals of control and formality and periods of wildness and naturalism. From the rigid symmetry of Tudor knot gardens and Baroque parterres to the sweeping pastoral landscapes of Capability Brown and later the romantic cottage gardens of Gertrude Jekyll, Each era has reflected changing cultural values, aesthetic preferences, and relationships with nature. The Victorian obsession with exoticism and vivid floral bedding gave way to the softer, more painterly plantings of the arts and craft movement. In recent decades, the pendulum has swung again, this time toward rewilding, sustainability and biodiversity. Today's English gardens embrace a gentle form of stewardship where ecological health is as important as visual beauty. Designers and gardeners alike are guided not only by taste, but by a deepening awareness of climate change, habitat loss, and the urgent need to support pollinators and wildlife. Yet even as gardens become wilder in appearance and intention, echoes of formality persist through structure, rhythm, and the human desire to shape space. This blending of wild and ordered, of art and ecology, defines the present moment in English garden design. Looking ahead, the future of English gardening likely lies in adaptive, climate-resilient landscape gardens that are not only ecologically sound, but also responsive to shifting weather patterns and resource scarcity. Expect to see an even greater emphasis on native planting, water-wise design, urban gardening, and regenerative practices. Digital tools help gardeners monitor soil health and biodiversity, while community gardens and public green spaces may grow in cultural importance as people seek deeper connection with nature in everyday life. The wild side of English gardening is not a rejection of design, but a redefinition of it, where beauty emerges from resilience and where human creativity works in partnership with natural processes. As always, English gardens will continue to inspire, not by staying the same, but by evolving quietly, boldly, and always in dialogue with the world around them.